My name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Thursday, May 1st, 2025. It's been 573 days since the attacks by Hamas on October 7th of 2023. So this is a weekly summary. There's a lot of news. One of the realities we've been saying for more than a year, this is a broader Middle East war. And so one of the reasons these updates seem to get longer and longer is we're talking about half a dozen countries and geographic locations, not just what's happening in Gaza and Israel. I'll start with Gaza. The blockade on Gaza this week, I read in Israeli news that it has already hit 60 days. Someone I just talked to said that Friday is the 60th day. Regardless, there has not been food, water, humanitarian assistance, or any trucks allowed into Gaza for the last 2 months. Germany, France, and Britain urged the Israeli government to end its intolerable blockade on aid. They pointed to Israel's international law obligations, and they warned of an acute risk of starvation, epidemic, disease, and death if Israel does not immediately restart a rapid and unimpeded flow of humanitarian assistance. So I think, sometimes I give these updates every day and it's hard to understand what it means that there are no trucks, that there's, no food being brought in. We were meeting with the Egyptians yesterday with the Egyptian ambassador to the US. And he said that Gaza needs, because the needs are so acute, that even the number of trucks before October 2023, if they were 500 trucks a day during 5 business days, he said the needs now are so much more acute. The minimum amount that would be needed would be 600 to 1,000 trucks per day, and 0 have gone in the last 60 days. The official death toll in Gaza is roughly 52,000. The vast majority of experts say that's significantly less than the total number of deaths because of bodies that remain under the rubble and because of deaths that are not directly caused, by the violence. Aid groups have said that they're running out of food. The markets are bare. Bakeries do not have flour. Soup kitchens that at times were providing the only meal for a family once a day have closed. Palestinian families are struggling to feed their children. I just talked to a dear friend who leads one of the largest development agencies in Gaza. And for the past several weeks, his family has only been having 1 meal a day. And he's one of the most privileged, having a job and access, to the international community. So just to give you an example, in a sprawling tent camp in Khan Yunis, there's a family, Miriam al-Najjar, and her mother-in-law emptied 4 cans combined of peas and carrots into a pot. They boiled it over a wood fire. They added a little bit of bouillon and some spices, and they had a plate of rice. And that was the only meal on Friday for 11 members of their family, including 6 children. That's just to give you a tiny picture of what we're talking about. And I won't talk about the fact that water supplies are being destroyed and then not allowed to be rebuilt. And so we can talk about water as well. I won't go through the death toll for every day this past week, except to say that every day people in Gaza are dying. Last Thursday, for example, 61 people were killed in the Strip, 46 specifically in Gaza City and North Gaza. The following day, Israeli strikes killed another 50 people. The Dura Children's Hospital in Gaza City became non-operational after the Children's Hospital was struck by an Israeli strike, damaged the facility's intensive care unit and solar panels. Residents in Gaza are fearing that they will soon be living in ghettos and that they won't be able to leave. More than 70% of Gaza is a no-go zone, so the entire population is only in about 1/3 of the Gaza Strip. Israel's army this past week has been flattening the remains of the city of Rafah on the southern edge of the Strip, and I've been reading accounts of Palestinians who are fearing that this clearing will be so that tent cities can be moved there, and then a fence, a gate, that they would be put into essentially a ghetto. Excuse the expression. Hearings this week began at the International Court of Justice at The Hague over the allegations that Israel's breaking international law by refusing to allow aid into Gaza. Israel said it will not allow the entry of supplies until Hamas releases all of the remaining hostages. Meanwhile, the World Food Program said last Friday it ran out of food. That was 7 weeks after the blockade, the complete siege began. One of the things I heard when I was in the Middle East just in the last week or so was that people in Gaza feel like they have 3 choices. You die by a bomb, you die because you're hungry, or you die by being recruited into a militant group and fighting and dying from death in that regard. And so death has been pervasive. Israel boycotted the opening day of the ICJ on its decision to ban the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees. That's UNRWA. Moving on to the occupied West Bank. It continues to be under attack. These are just some of the incidents. I'm speaking specifically of either incursions by the Israeli government or settler extremism. Israeli settlers torched homes, goat pens, and shot at Palestinian residents in the West Bank. This was in the Bardala village this week. Settlers entered the village. They were followed by IDF soldiers who then arrested 5 locals suspected of throwing rocks. We ran from our homes and took nothing. Everything is gone, said one villager. Israeli settlers burned down houses and lands in that village of Bardala. There were ongoing military operations by the IDF in Kalkia city in the West Bank. At least 1 house was occupied and turned into a military post. A Palestinian was shot dead in clashes with the IDF in Salem village, which is east of Nablus. Settlers attacked Nihalin, which is near Ramallah, and residents were advised to not go outside. And earlier this month, there was an incident in the South Hebron area in Masafer Yatta. This happened on April 17th. In a village called Al-Rakiz, an Israeli settler shot a 60-year-old sheikh, Saed Ra'aba, in the leg, forcing him to undergo amputation. But it was reported that when the soldiers arrived to the scene after the sheikh had been shot by settlers, they arrested Sheikh Said's sons, who they handcuffed, blindfolded, and transferred to Ofer prison. Just yesterday, the Israeli army carried out raids against the occupied West Bank in the town of Beitah, south of Nablus, and settlers set Palestinian agricultural land on fire in the West Bank. There was a quote that I heard from an Israeli government official who said, or maybe it wasn't a government official, and maybe it's later on in the update, but it was a quote that was in the news this week that talked about an Israeli saying that the government, everything that is happening is allowing settlement expansion and settler extremism to go rampant in the West Bank. The Israelis have threatened to intensify their operations in Gaza if hostages are not returned home. The chief of staff, he's new, the Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, said if we do not see progress in the return of the hostages, we will expand our activities into a more intense and significant operation until we reach a decisive outcome. And we at Purchase for Middle East Peace have been calling since day 1 for the return of the hostages, but to use food and water against a civilian population as leverage is morally unacceptable, but also a violation of international law. And Palestinians are not the only ones losing their lives. They're dying at an exponentially higher rate, but Israeli soldiers are being traumatized by PTSD and are also being killed. There was an Israeli reservist in North Gaza who was killed this week. 2 other soldiers were seriously wounded. The reservist was a tank driver who was 26 years old. His name was Asaf Kafri. And he was killed by sniper fire. A 19-year-old border police officer, Nata Itzak Kahani, from Moshav Eitan, an IDF officer, 21-year-old Captain Ido Volach from Jerusalem were both killed in North Gaza as well. After Netanyahu publicly accused Ronen Bar, who led Shin Bet, which is the internal security for Israel, Netanyahu publicly accused Ronen Bar of lying to the Israeli Supreme Court. And so this has been culminating for several weeks, but Ronen Bar announced this week he will resign from the Shin Bet security service. He said, as the head of the organization, I took responsibility, and now on this special evening, this was at a ceremony for fallen service members, he said, I take on the special evening symbolizing memory, heroism, and sacrifice, I've chosen to announce the implementation and end my role as the head of the Israeli Security Agency. In Israel, one of the things that's been happening, I heard also that there's such division within Israeli society that there were even concerns that this division within Israeli society could become a civil war. And so here is an example. There were far-right Israeli activists who demonstrated against a group called Standing Together. Standing Together is led by a Jewish Israeli. There are Palestinians who are also a part of it, Israeli citizens. And Standing Together was honoring children killed in Gaza, and far-right Israeli activists demonstrated against them, harassing demonstrators, tearing the pictures of the children who'd been killed, placing stickers on them, meaning Kahana, saying Kahana was right. The police were not properly prepared. In the end, this is the words of the Standing Together folks, we had to have the police follow us from behind while right-wing protesters were trying to get to us. Wildfires have broken out all over Israel, and what's believed it could be the worst burning in Israeli history. Flames and smokes have covered the highway with cars ablaze. Panicked drivers and passengers have abandoned their vehicles and fled. This is just in the last 2 to 3 days. Numerous communities in the hills have been evacuated. Whipping winds caused the fires to escalate, so much so that Israel put out an SOS to Greece, Croatia, and Cyprus for material assistance to battle the flames. 2,900 acres were on fire because of the wildfires. And the IDF has been called to assist. Police have been fighting wildfires in the Jerusalem hills as towns are being evacuated. Things became so severe that the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv road, I'm assuming that's Route 1, were shut down. Dozens have suffered smoke inhalation burns, but as of yesterday, nobody was seriously hurt. In terms of the Palestinians, in unprecedented remarks, Mahmoud Abbas, the president, called on Hamas to release the hostages, to block Israel's justifications for the genocide that Gaza is being subjected to. That's a direct quote. He called on Hamas to refrain from carrying arms and to transform into a political party that operates according to the laws of the Palestinian state. Now, you can interpret this lots of different ways. This, I'm sure, is welcomed by many of the Western states. We're calling for the laying down of arms of all parties, so it's not about the content. But some are saying that by Abbas doing this, he's giving away leverage to the West instead of using it as a negotiating tactic. He's giving away things freely, if you will. That was just a political comment I heard. Hussein al-Sheikh was officially appointed the deputy of the PA and the PLO. This is because there's been a lot of pressure from the West that Abbas, who's in his 80s, has to name a successor. It could be that this role of a new deputy of the PA and PLO, Hussein al-Sheikh, would officially be that deputy. Turkey, Jordan, Egypt congratulated and welcomed him on assuming this position. In terms of negotiations and a ceasefire deal, I wish I had good news, but Hamas met with mediators in Cairo. Hamas said they're willing to a 5-year halt in fighting, and it would be a one-time, everything happens at the same time. All hostages are exchanged, prisoners are released. It would be, instead of a gradual ceasefire agreement, Hamas said they will not do a phased agreement after the last agreement did not proceed into phase 2. The Israeli hostage team was also set to meet with Egyptians. The intelligence chief in Egypt, Ron Dermer, the head of strategic affairs, was supposed to have those meetings in Cairo. And then Mossad on Thursday, the head of Mossad met with Qatar's prime minister and said there's been, quote, a bit of progress in terms of efforts to broker a new Israel-Hamas ceasefire, but there is no answer for the ultimate question of how to end this war. In Jordan, there was an arrest last week of 16 people who were connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. President Abbas, I met with him a couple weeks ago, and he mentioned that the Palestinians shared the intelligence that allowed for these arrests. There's been a crackdown of Palestinian resistance in Jordan and in Syria and other parts of the Middle East as well. In Lebanon, Israel has yet to withdraw from the 5 points of its remaining presence in South Lebanon. Over the weekend, the Israeli military struck a residential neighborhood in the Dahiyah district of South Beirut. Lebanon's president warned Israel's actions that it could escalate tensions, raising concerns that that very fragile ceasefire could be in jeopardy. There's been a lot of movement in terms of Yemen. We've been talking about how the U.S. has perpetuated airstrikes against the Houthis. The Houthis have been attacking, of course, for months, ships in the shipping lane. A missile launched from Yemen towards Israel was intercepted outside of Israeli territory on Saturday. And 68 people were killed in a U.S. airstrike on a detention center that housed African migrants in northwest Yemen. That's a Houthi-controlled area. And so this is not being widely reported in the United States, how active the U.S. has been in our bombing and the number of deaths as a result of U.S. bombing. The strikes were hours after U.S. Central Command announced that the U.S. had hit over 800 targets since Trump ordered the escalations of a campaign against the Houthis on March 15th. The Houthis have said that they successfully shot down 7 multi-million-dollar U.S. drones in the past month. The British Air Force joined in attacks in Yemen for the first time with the U.S. Air Force this past week. That was a big deal for the U.K. to engage in that. They said they're addressing the persistent threat from Houthis to the freedom of navigation. And the Houthis said they have targeted military strikes in Tel Aviv, and last I heard, there were 3 U.S. aircraft carriers in the Middle East. I know the Truman is there, the USS Truman, but there's been active hostilities between the U.S. there and the Houthis. Trump is privately and publicly urging Egypt to compensate the United States, because what's happened is the U.S. is saying they're bombing the Houthis. The Houthis are stopping shipping, and that has had a multi-million-dollar effect on the Egyptian economy. And now Trump is saying Egypt owes the U.S. because the U.S. is bombing the Houthis. This is a mechanism the Trump administration's been using of seeking financial benefits for U.S. foreign policy. This is happening in the Ukraine. It's happening related to Gaza as well. In Saudi Arabia, the U.S. is poised to offer Saudi Arabia an arms package over $100 billion. Trump's first international visit will be in May to Saudi Arabia, and so that arms deal will be a part of the conversations there. In Syria, Syria is looking for sanctions relief. The U.S. put out a list of conditions for potential partial sanctions release. Syria has said they've addressed them, but they're still seeking mutual understanding. So they're in conversation with Washington. There was an Israeli strike on the outskirts of the Syrian capital, Damascus, yesterday that killed 1 member of Syria's new security forces. The IDF said they were responding because there were escalations between Druze civilians and sectarians, which I'll talk about in a minute, in Syria. Last night, this was late last night, Israel launched strikes and intervened in these sectarian clashes in Damascus. So here's what's been happening, and I don't think I summarized this very well in the last couple of days. There's been worsening violence between the Druze and Sunni gunmen, and dozens of people have been killed in the south suburbs of Damascus. So Druze is a religious sect. There are Druze that are a part of the Syrian geography. There are Druze that are in the Golan Heights, which is considered occupied. And then, of course, there are Druze in Israel as well. And so this is becoming an escalated conflict between Israel and Syria as these sectarian groups, the Druze and the Sunni, have been fighting, and dozens of people were killed. This also, one of the questions is, how much does the new Syrian government have control over these sectarian groups? The impetus for that was on Tuesday. There was an audio recording that was said to be from a well-known Druze cleric that was insulting the Prophet Muhammad. The cleric denied it. The Syrian Interior Ministry did its own investigation and said this was not a real recording. That's what provoked all of those deaths. In Iran, 5 people were killed. There was an explosion in Iran in their main port. 700 people were wounded. This is in Bandar Abbas, the biggest port in Iran. Later, it was said this was because of a failure to observe safety principles. Essentially, there was a shipment that was highly explosive that was not marked as such. I read. President Trump last Friday said that the U.S. would join Israel in attacking Iran if a nuclear deal is not reached. And so there are significant concerns in the Arab world about the potential of Iran escalating further, and U.S. attacks or Israeli attacks on Iran, vice versa, of course, is also a concern. A U.S. official stated that the last round of the Iran-U.S. talks, which were in Muscat, Oman, they were direct and indirect. They were positive and productive. There's supposed to be another round of talks in Europe this week. And then shifting to the U.S., I wanted to give a little bit of an update on the security establishment. We've been talking a lot about militarization. Amid the U.S. bombing campaign in Yemen, a jet fighter fell off the USS Harry Truman and sank when the ship made a sharp turn. I didn't hear of any injuries or deaths of U.S. soldiers, but this is the group's third mishap since its Middle East deployment. Officials are saying it's unclear whether the intensified pace of operations, because things have been so significant, is factoring in. The Pentagon has been described as a free-for-all. There have been conversations about whether or not Pete Hegseth, our Secretary of Defense, should be replaced. This is in response to that hoopla with Signal and his wife and lawyer and the Atlantic News getting reports about U.S. attacks prior to them happening. But senior aides have said there's delays of memos and actions, and there's infighting. And essentially, it sounds like it's a bit chaotic. The House Republicans unveiled a bill that proposes a $150 billion increase in Pentagon spending. This would bring the total defense budget for 2025 to more than $1 trillion. The legislation developed by the House and Senate Armed Services Committee would allocate $25 billion for essentially a Golden Dome missile defense project. You're familiar in Israel, there's the Iron Dome. This would put a Golden Dome over the United States that would shield the entire continental U.S. from advanced missile threats. So that's being proposed. And one of the most critical roles that the U.S. is playing is there's an office in Jerusalem. It's led by General Fensel. He's a 3-star general. It's called the U.S. Security Coordinator, the USSC in Jerusalem. General Fensel leads an international body of coordination that coordinates with the Israelis, with Kogat in the occupied West Bank, and with the Palestinian police forces. And the U.S. announced this week they're planning to eliminate this post, which this was up on the chopping block under the Biden administration. And the Israelis said, please don't do this. This is bad for our security. It's not determined if this is a done deal yet. This is deeply, deeply disconcerting. Just to let you know, this is the office that under the Biden administration, when there were sanctions against extremist settlers, this is the group that does that coordination and that regulation. I have just a couple more updates in terms of the U.S. President Trump has claimed he's pushed Netanyahu on Gaza aid. This was aboard Air Force One, where Trump was asked whether or not concerns about humanitarian assistance into Gaza were a part of his conversation with Netanyahu. He had this last week. He said, Gaza came up. We've got to be good on Gaza. People are suffering. We're going to take care of that. There's a big need for medicine, food, and medicine, and we're taking care of it. Now, this was at least 3 days ago, if not 5 days ago. But we've not seen any aid or assistance into the Strip since. The head of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division has been redirecting staff focus on combating anti-Semitism, anti-Christian bias, and what's called woke ideology. These attempts to combat anti-Semitism have significant influence on Palestinian advocacy, which is why I'm raising that. And this week, a pro-Israel hawk was appointed to a position within the White House. Her name is Mirav Keren, C-E-R-E-N. She's an established GOP policy hand with close ties to pro-Israel think tanks. She's set to oversee the National Security Council's portfolios on both Israel and Iran. There's a sizable chunk of Republicans who are saying that Trump is going too far. About 1/4 of Republicans are saying that. This is in general. 40% said the president should not be able to deport legal immigrants who criticize Israel, which Trump has done. And then news about the Mahmoud Khalil case. It is said that federal agents arrested him without a warrant, according to court documents. So that case is continuing. There's a lawsuit against the Trump administration for deporting people for holding pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel views. That will go to trial. And yesterday, there was some good news. A federal judge in Vermont released Moshe Madawi, who's the Palestinian Columbia University student. He's a lawful U.S. resident. He's the one that was detained at his, I think he's the one that was detained at his interview for citizenship. The Trump administration detained him even though he was facing no criminal charges. Harvard, there were two reports, scathing reports that came out this week, one on anti-Semitism, one on anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian bias. Both were terribly negative. Harvard has promised to change after these negative reports were released. The president, Alan Garber, issued an apology. So that was in the news this week. Harvard is suing the Trump administration, and they're still in that battle. And there was a report that came out this week that I might just do an independent video on if people are interested. This was in Israeli news in Hebrew. I've not seen it in American news. This was an expose on the Biden administration saying that Biden officials admit that they never pressured Israel for a ceasefire, as Israeli leaders are boasting of playing Washington. This was Channel 13 News, and there's so much information about that I would really like to share. It's things we experienced firsthand but didn't have evidence for, and now you have direct quotes from Israeli officials and direct quotes from American officials saying that what we thought was true, that there was no pressure. There's actually a quote from Herzog, and I don't know if it's the Israeli ambassador or the president because they're brothers, but one of the Herzogs said that Biden was a gift from God to allow us to do what we needed to do in terms of perpetuating killing in Gaza. That's not a direct quote, but if I do that video update, I have that quote for you. There are two big events coming up at the UN. In May, there is an event it's sponsored by the Committee on the Exercise of Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. The event it happens every May around the Nakba commemorations, but this is international action towards ending the Nakba and realizing the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. And then there's another event in June that's being convened by the French and the Saudis. It's a peace summit on the two-state solution and ending the violence that's happening in Gaza. It's not yet certain whether or not the heads of state will attend. And Shadi Hori had a hearing this week. It ultimately was postponed till June 30th. And His Holiness Pope Francis's funeral was this week. 50 world leaders attended, including representatives of the Palestinian Authority. Israeli leaders chose not to pay their respects. The conclave for the Pope will begin on May 7th. This week was the 110th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. We did an event at St. Mary's here in DC. You can watch that video. So that is a conclusion to the summary of news for this week. May God continue to go before us in our efforts towards peace.